Once again, it's that time. The time when we reflect on the past year and then move forward into the next. Before we do that, though, why don't we take a look back at some of the trials and tribulations that audiences had to endure. On top of the usual batch of wretched comedies and misguided sequels, 2016 featured the resurgence of the video game adaptations, movies that are notorious for their consistently low level of quality. Now, in this age where geek culture is celebrated and Uwe Boll has retired, you might think that filmmakers would finally learn how to translate our favorite games to the big screen in a way that pleases both hardcore fans and general audiences alike. Well, you'd be wrong. These flicks still suck. I should know. I saw most of them. Surprisingly though, they weren't the worst things to come out this year, if you can believe it. But now I'm getting ahead of myself. Before we dive into the main list, here are some apparently awful films that escaped my radar for one reason or another. These are the dishonorable mentions. Dirty Grandpa. Many people were labeling this as a new low point for Robert De Niro's career, and I can't really say that I disagree with them. This comes across as one of those modern comedies that I can't stand, the kind that tries to disguise its lack of imagination by being as childish and disgusting as possible. That alone was enough to keep me away. Allegiant. Not only is this part of a genre that I despise, but it also falls back on that tired practice of splitting one book into two movies. To my surprise though, I was not the only one to pass this film up. As a result of diminishing box office returns, this series is now set to go out on a whimper with a TV movie. Considering how paper-thin these allegories and characters are, I'd be lying if I said I wasn't relieved. Alice Through the Looking Glass. The fact that they made a sequel to Alice in Narnia is perplexing enough, but releasing it a whopping 6 years later? Not even Tim Burton could be bothered with this. But don't worry, we still have Johnny Depp as the insipid Mad Hatter and Helena Bonham Carter as the shrill Red Queen. Yeah, if these two weirdos think that I'm gonna watch them chew the scenery again, then they've got another thing coming. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Out of the Shadows. Maybe it's because I didn't grow up with this franchise, but I have absolutely no interest in watching 4 giant, anthropomorphic turtles fight a jive-talking rhino and warthog.
Call me Mr. Pig!
Especially not with these ugly character designs. Somehow, Stephen Amell looks more dignified next to a bunch of colorfully costumed superheroes than he does here. That is saying something. Ben-Hur. It's no secret that we get a bunch of faith-based films released each year, but I ask you, was there really any need to remake one of the best-known biblical epics of all time? Is there really an audience for that nowadays, especially in the middle of August? Apparently not, considering what a bomb this turned out to be. I guess Morgan Freeman in fake dreadlocks just wasn't as good a selling point as Charlton Heston. Assassin's Creed. As unengaging as these games' storylines can be, I can't really say that I was itching for a cinematic expansion. In fact, I stopped playing them after Black Flag. I'm so burnt out on this series that the last thing I want is to see a big screen version with even more of the dull, modern-day segments that no one cared about in the first place. Seriously, Ubisoft, go back to Rayman. At least he had some charm. 9 Lives. It's Kevin Spacey as a cat. Why? I'm not really sure, but I do know that it's going to take him a while to live this down. Ghostbusters. I actively avoided this movie, not just because of the wretched trailers, but also out of principle. I hate the fact that they remade one of the great 80s classics. Paul Feig and his brand of humor have never appealed to me. The only member of this new female team that I can stomach is Kate McKinnon, and the underlying tactics reportedly used to push Ivan Reitman out of the picture make me sick. Above all though, it was the immature responses to criticism on the part of those involved that ultimately drove me away. I could not in good conscience support a film when the people behind it feel the need to insult their audience. Then again, maybe I just hate women. Regardless, we already have Ghostbusters 3. It's called Ghostbusters the video game. Now, on to the main list.
Number 10.
Ratchet and Clank. I never played the Ratchet and Clank games as a kid. I've always been a Jak and Daxter guy. Having gotten into them recently though, I can tell you that this movie doesn't do them a whole lot of favors. Granted, the cartoonish designs and energetic animation are nearly perfect representations of the game's aesthetic, and the voice acting is surprisingly accomplished, especially from series veterans James Arnold Taylor, David Kaye, and Jim Ward. Unfortunately, the clever digs at pop culture have been replaced by juvenile humor and topical jokes, which never let up. Literally every single line of dialogue exists for some obvious punchline. The film is just so in your face, always throwing some over-the-top action scene, loud noise, or chaotic camera movement at you, almost never allowing the story to just breathe. Ratchet and Clank themselves barely have any scenes together, so we hardly ever get to see their friendship develop. Instead, we're forced to spend time with a slew of other one-note characters in a cliched story with only fleeting hints of the self-awareness that the series is known for. If you want a comedic space adventure with more heart and wit, just play the games. You'll have more fun and get a much bigger bang for your buck.
Number 9.
Warcraft. While I'm admittedly unfamiliar with this fantasy franchise, I have been an avid proponent of performance capture since its inception, and it seemed like the perfect tool to bring real personality to these oversized orcs. Make no mistake, the technology is the most striking aspect of this flick, giving these fantastical creatures an impressive level of detail and weight. However, it does little to make up for the two-dimensional characters and mess of a plot. The film struggles to balance the humans and the orcs, constantly cutting back and forth between the two sides with little rhyme or reason and diminishing the impact of what should be a crushing conflict. We're never given a clear idea of the differing cultures, ideologies, and histories of these two races, so it's hard to feel like there's much at stake when these factions clash. As a result, the actors are left with little to work with. This struggle is made all the more apparent by the fact that most of these players are either criminally underwritten, distractingly miscast, or both. Travis Fimmel, Paula Patton, and Toby Kebbell all turn in fairly nuanced performances, but they're ultimately let down by a weak script that doesn't even come close to achieving the pathos that it so desperately strives toward. For a more engaging tale of two warring societies, watch Dawn of the Planet of the Apes. It also uses performance capture, and it even has Toby Kebbell.
Number 8.
Criminal. Talk about a waste of a good idea. The mind of a CIA agent being put into the brain of a convicted felon? It's ludicrous, yet rife with potential. The problem is that the movie is so fixated on this premise that it doesn't even bother giving us a single interesting character. Despite the efforts of big-name talents like Kevin Costner, Gary Oldman, and Tommy Lee Jones, these people all just come off as thinly written archetypes. What's worse is that there are so many. This story has far too many moving parts, and it's tough to work up an interest in any of them. So what we're left with is a bunch of boring morons in a muddled narrative that constantly begs you to take it seriously. Every plot point is treated with melodramatic seriousness, but the bland direction prevents these moments from achieving even half of their intended impact. Rather than overcomplicating things with some generic terrorism scheme, the film really should have focused more on the psychological and familial repercussions of its concept, as those were the only parts that didn't almost put me to sleep. However, that would have actually had the potential to emotionally engage the audience, which clearly wasn't in the repertoire here. For a more compelling and stylish flick with a similar idea, check out Face Off.
Number 7.
Term Life. Now, let me say that I like seeing Vince Vaughn play a more serious role, but was this really the avenue through which to do it? I'm honestly struggling to come up with things to say about this because of how generic and forgettable it is. The story is one we've seen numerous times before with infinitely more passion. An over-the-hill killer with a very particular set of skills tries to reconnect with his daughter or another young woman and winds up having to protect her from a bunch of bad guys.
I am tired of it all.
The film had a potentially interesting idea in that the main character merely plans heists instead of actually committing them, but this bit of uniqueness is quickly forgotten about. Instead, we're forced to sit through the same tired tropes delivered by a cast that's way too good for this, hence the uninterested performances. However, can you really blame them? This plot and these stunts are so uninspired that they wouldn't even fly in some of the worst direct-to-video action flicks, which coincidentally is also the level of directorial prowess on display here. Everything about this feels recycled from the bargain bin. When I'm more fascinated by this silly hairpiece than anything else, you've got a problem. For a father-daughter action flick done right, give Bloodfather a shot.
Number 6.
Kingsglaive, Final Fantasy XV. I haven't been this simultaneously bored and confused since, well, Final Fantasy XIII. This isn't so much a movie as it is a 2-hour prologue for the game released later. So much nonsensical information is thrown at you that it quickly becomes overwhelming. This kingdom is at war with that kingdom, this person betrayed that person, Niflheim this, Tenebrae that, blah blah blah.
Yap yap blah blah dribble dribble dribble.
We're constantly told to care about these people and places, but we're never given any sufficient reason to. We're just bombarded with more, to the point where it all devolves into a jumble of terms and names thrown together into a surplus of superfluous subplots, which only serve to convolute what should be a straightforward narrative. This ensures that we never spend much time with one underdeveloped character before moving on to another. leading to some disinterested performances from the voice cast. At least they're rendered effectively. In fact, the animation captures an incredible degree of detail and fluidity, especially during the over-the-top action scenes. During the more intimate scenes, though, it drifts into the uncanny valley and becomes unpleasant. If you want a less off-putting and more coherent story of this type, just watch Troy. Or you could watch the last 20 minutes of Advent Children for some mindless fun.
Number 5.
Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice. This is a film that is so long, so ugly, so narratively jumbled, and so infuriatingly pretentious that it defies belief.
Cry me a river.
The two greatest superheroes of all time have now been turned into murderous morons by a hack with no understanding of what a hero actually is. Come to think of it, he doesn't seem to have any understanding of people in general. Not only are most of the performances utterly flat and lifeless, but the dialogue is so preoccupied with conveying the heavy-handed themes that it fails to give the numerous characters any semblance of personality. Once the movie finally forgoes being a boring political drama, we're treated to a barrage of excessively destructive action scenes that basically amount to artificial CGI and noise. Lots and lots of noise. So the film fails in being a think piece and a blockbuster. That's not even factoring in the ruthlessly dour tone, lackluster score, inconsistent pace, and terrible excuse for a villain in Eisenlex. Yes, Batfleck and Alfred Ironsworth are a revelation, but how can they truly shine when they're surrounded by so much nonsense? How can I get excited for the dozens of other films that you're clumsily setting up when you can't even engage me with this one? I should have gone to see My Big Fat Greek Wedding too. At least that had charm. Come to think of it, The Flash guest starring on Supergirl gave me more enjoyment than this dreck with a fraction of the budget. Do you want a much better team up between these two titans? Watch the 90s animated crossover World's Finest.
Number 4.
The Legend of Tarzan. It may be better than that 2014 abomination, but that ain't saying much. Rather than attempting to bring the famous ape man to a modern audience and further explore his identity, this film falls back on a painfully standard story that basically amounts to
Jane in trouble. Tarzan must rescue.
really. There's not much more to it than that. And a similar problem plagues the characters. Alexander Skarsgård's Tarzan is flat and lacks any charisma. Margot Robbie's Jane is bland and annoying. Samuel L. Jackson plays Samuel L. Jackson for the umpteenth time. And Christoph Waltz falls back on the same polite Eurovillain routine that he's been doing for years. This is a film that subsists on cliches, so the plot doesn't really move so much as it slowly chugs along to the next predictable beat. You don't even have anything worthwhile to look at amongst the tedium. Unlike the Jungle Book remake, the CG animals and blue screen forest look artificial and shallow. Making matters worse is director David Yates applying the same desaturated color palette that he used in the last 4 Harry Potter films. What should be a lush and colorful jungle instead comes off as a depressingly dull swamp. How appropriate, since this is a paint-by-the-numbers slog that fails to add anything new to the iconic tale. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Stick to the Disney version or the Johnny Weissmuller flicks.
Number 3.
The Huntsman Winters War. Here is an unnecessary sequel if I've ever seen one. Wait, no, it's actually a prequel, parallel, sequel thing. Yep, one of those, cut from the same cloth of desperation as 300 Rise of an Empire. And guess what? The Lion King 1.5 is still the only good one, mainly because it has fun with its ridiculous premise. Granted, this flick tries to be more fun than its self-serious and mediocre predecessor, but it fails on nearly every level. The tongue-in-cheek humor and supposedly witty quips come across as awkward at best and obnoxious at worst, ultimately falling as flat as the romance. Yeah, there's still a romance, despite the script going on and on about the power of love.
That's the power of love.
None of the relationships feel the least bit credible due to the lack of development as well as the absence of any chemistry between these otherwise capable actors. Charlize Theron and Emily Blunt each seem to be doing their own overly theatrical impression of Marilyn Monroe, while Jessica Chastain, looking laughably out of place, puts on one of the phoniest Scottish accents I've ever heard. Poor Chris Hemsworth is trapped in the middle, trying to make the best of it. Unfortunately, his efforts are in vain, as these characters are so thinly motivated and inconsistent that it'd be tough for even the best actor to lend any weight to what they're saying. Throw in a trite fantasy setting filled with uninspired designs, unconvincing special effects, and vaguely defined locales, and you've got an exceedingly boring sword and sorcery flick that fails to justify its meager existence. No wonder Kristen Stewart turned this down. Once again, if you need your fantasy fix, you might want to revisit the realm of Middle-earth.
Number 2.
Gods of Egypt. This is one of those rare filmmaking disasters. The type of flick where nearly everything on screen is so unbelievably awful that it's actually kind of fascinating.
He's like a wreck on the highway, all right? You don't want to look, but you just gotta.
Now, I'm sure that many of you have heard about the whole whitewashing controversy that surrounded this film's production, but trust me, that is the least of this movie's problems. Nothing, I repeat, nothing works. For something as overproduced as this, it's downright shocking how amateurish it is from a filmmaking standpoint. You can't connect with anyone or anything because none of it feels the least bit real, physically or emotionally. The dialogue is unnatural and cringeworthy, the acting is over the top, the characters are obnoxious, the effects look laughably fake, the overly flashy action scenes are entirely devoid of tension or excitement, and the plot is moronic and riddled with gaping holes. It really is astounding. I can't think of a single aspect of this heap that doesn't completely eat. I just sat there, transfixed at the never-ending barrage of creative missteps, wondering how any of the people involved could possibly be satisfied with what was being put on screen. However, this wonderment soon gave way to annoyance, as the depths of awfulness began to sink in and I just wanted to stop watching. I had to force myself to continue even though the film never gave me any reason to. That should not be the case with a Shakespearean setup like this. Do you know a movie that handled this Hamlet-esque premise much better? So do I. It's called The Lion King. Just go watch that. Or play God of War 3 for some sweet god-slaying goodness.
Number 1.
The Fifth Wave. This genre needs to die a horribly excruciating death and be cast back into the fiery pit of stupidity from whence it came. These young adult dystopian stories have long overstayed their welcome, and believe it or not, this may be the worst of the whole bunch. A movie so painfully uninspired and unambitious that it is just plain boring.
It's so boring!
Not one aspect of this flick stands out or indicates anything resembling real effort or finesse. It's all just so thoroughly unremarkable that it puts you to sleep. If we're not dealing with some generic alien invasion plot, we're forced to sit through a romance so passionless, poorly written, and chemically dead that you'd swear it was executed by actual aliens attempting to replicate human behavior. The dialogue is just clunky, cliched, and childish, sounding like something out of the mind of an elementary schooler. As bad as these lines are, though, that doesn't excuse performances like these. I didn't think that they could find a worse actress than Jennifer Lawrence to headline one of these things, but lo and behold, they managed it. To say that Chloe Grace Moretz is as dull as a rock would be an insult to rocks. She's embarrassingly wooden and lacking in any conviction, possessing neither the presence nor the talent to carry a film, let alone a franchise. To be fair though, none of these young actors give anything resembling a good performance, seeming to mistake flatness for gravitas. That seems to be the general approach for the whole movie. You see, these filmmakers seem to think that making everything downbeat and full of sullen angst automatically equates to emotional depth. What it accomplishes instead is draining the film of what little energy it has, challenging you not to nod off. Of course, then you see Liev Schreiber and Maria Bello and wonder just what bet they lost to land here. Actors of their caliber shouldn't be wasting their time with this. In fact, no one should waste their time with this. If you're looking for a cleverly written, powerfully acted, and unnervingly directed film about alien infiltrators, watch John Carpenter's The Thing. For a poignant, post-apocalyptic drama with a powerful teenage protagonist, play The Last of Us. Stay away from this. It's a tedious, poorly performed, flatly directed, and wretchedly written piece of trash that doesn't understand the depths of its own juvenility. More to the point, it's the worst movie I've seen in 2016. Thanks for watching. Feel free to like, subscribe, and/or comment. Until next time.